The iron tang of her blood cut through the banquet's heavy grease and stale ale. It wasn't a sweet scent. It was raw copper and panic. Across the hall, the Alpha King stopped breathing. Then, the impossible sound. Kneecap hitting stone. A 300-year reign of standing dominance shattered. The great hall of Dunhelm tasted of wet fur, wood smoke, and too much unwashed flesh. 3 massive hearths blazed, but they did little to cut the bone-deep dampness of the stone walls. It was the winter solstice feast, an obligation of noise and gluttony that set everyone's teeth on edge. Sabine wanted nothing more than to take off her left shoe. There was a hole in the woolen sock, and the rough leather was rubbing a blister raw against her heel with every step. She shifted her weight, balancing a massive iron-wrought tray of roasted root vegetables against her hip. Her arms shook. She wasn't built for the heavy lifting of the upper keep. 1. She was a laundress, drafted into the kitchen service because half the scullery maids had come down with the ague. Her hands, usually pickled in lye and hot water, were chapped. The knuckles split and red. She kept her head down. Survival in Dunhelm meant being part of the furniture. If you were a tapestry or a wooden bench, the wolves didn't look at you. At the high table, Alistair sat like a corpse strapped to a chair. He was the Alpha King. He had held the title for over 3 centuries, his aging process frozen by the sheer, terrifying potency of his bloodline. He did not look like the romanticized lords in the tapestries. His face was a map of old violence, a flattened nose, a jagged white line cutting through his beard, eyes the color of dirty ice. He wore no crown, only a heavy mantle of black bearskin that made his shoulders look impossibly wide. Alistair was bored. The boredom was a physical ache in his joints. He listened to the petty squabbles of the pack alphas below him. Border disputes, hunting rights, slighted honors. The noise was a meaningless drone. The beast beneath his skin slept, lethargic and unimpressed by the posturing of lesser wolves. He drank his wine. It tasted like vinegar. Down on the floor, Sabine navigated the narrow spaces between the long oak tables. Men barked for ale. Hands reached out, grabbing at trenchers of meat. She stepped backward to avoid a drunken lord leaning too far over his bench, and her heel struck the iron grating of the central fire pit. She stumbled. The heavy iron tray tipped. Sabine caught it, but the jagged, poorly forged edge of the tray sliced clean across the fleshy part of her palm. The pain was sharp, a sudden hiss of cold air against an open nerve. She gasped, dropping the tray onto the table with a loud clatter. Carrots and parsnips rolled across the grease-stained wood. No one cared about the vegetables, but a single drop of blood squeezed from her palm, bright red, and hit the heated iron of the fire pit grating. It hissed. It evaporated instantly. The scent hit the air. At the high table, Alistair stopped mid-breath. His wine goblet paused an inch from his mouth. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a molecular shift in the air. Copper, salt, the faint, undeniable musk of terror. It cut through the overwhelming stench of roasted pork, wet hound, and spilled ale like a sharpened blade, slicing through silk. The beast inside Alistair didn't wake up. It exploded. His pupils dilated so fast it physically hurt his eyes, the irises swallowing the icy blue until only black remained. His jaw locked. A low, vibrating hum started in his chest, a sound so deep it didn't register as noise, but as a vibration in the flagstones. Next to him, his second in command, a heavily scarred man named Cassius, stopped talking. Cassius looked at the king. Then, Cassius looked at his own hands, pressing them flat against the table. The hair on Cassius's arms was standing up. "My king?" Cassius whispered. The word sounded like a plea. Alistair didn't answer. He couldn't. His human mind was being suffocated by an instinct so violent and ancient, it felt like drowning. Mine. The word wasn't a thought. It was a physical pressure at the base of his skull. Mate. Blood. Claim. He slammed the silver goblet down. The stem buckled. Red wine splashed across the white linen, looking entirely too much like what he was smelling. He stood up. The scraping of his heavy wooden chair against the stone dais echoed like a gunshot. The great hall, previously roaring with the sound of 300 feasting werewolves, went dead silent. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Forks were lowered. Mugs stopped halfway to mouths. Every predatory eye in the room flicked to the high table. They felt it, too, the sudden, suffocating wave of alpha dominance rolling off the king. It made their chests tight. It made them want to bare their throats. Down by the fire pit, Sabine clutched her bleeding hand to her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt the drop in the room's temperature. She looked up, past the smoke, past the heads of the terrifying men she served. She met the king's eyes. They were completely black, and he was looking directly at her. Sabine couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs turned to solid ice. She had grown up hearing the stories. The wolves didn't take human mates. They took human servants. They took human prey. When a wolf looked at a human with eyes that dark, it meant someone was going to be torn apart. I bumped a table, she thought, her mind racing with a pathetic, frantic logic. I dropped a carrot. They don't kill you for dropping a carrot, do they? Alistair stepped off the dais. He didn't take the stairs. He simply dropped down the 4-foot height, his boots hitting the stone with a heavy, final thud. The crowd parted. They didn't just step back, they scrambled. Huge, battle-hardened men shoved each other out of the way, knocking over benches and spilling ale, desperate to clear a path. The king's aura was suffocating, a localized gravity that pushed everyone down. Alistair walked. His movements were wrong. He wasn't walking like a king inspecting his hall. He was moving like a predator, tracking a blood trail. His shoulders were hunched, his head lowered slightly. He was taking shallow, rapid breaths through his nose, tasting the air. Copper, salt, ash, cheap, lye soap, sweat. The scent was a physical tether pulling him across the room. Every rational thought in his 300-year-old brain was screaming in protest. She is a human, a servant. She smells of dirty water and fear. Stop! But the wolf was deaf to reason. The wolf only knew that the missing piece of its soul was standing by the fire pit, bleeding. Sabine backed up. Her heel hit the edge of the stone hearth. There was nowhere else to go. She wanted to run, but her legs were lead. She pressed her uninjured hand against the coarse wool of her skirts, trying to wipe the sweat from her palm. She was hyperventilating, shallow little gasps that sounded loud in the deathly quiet hall. Alistair stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, he was terrifying. He smelled of pine needles, ozone, and impending violence. His chest heaved. He stared down at her, towering over her small, trembling frame. Sabine squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the claws. She waited for teeth to tear into her throat. She tilted her chin up slightly, a final, desperate instinct to make the kill quick. Alistair stared at the exposed column of her throat. He saw the rapid, frantic flutter of her pulse beneath the pale skin. He saw a smudge of soot on her jaw. His hands twitched. He raised a hand. His fingers curled into half claws. A collective gasp echoed from the nearest tables. The king was going to execute a servant in the middle of the solstice feast. It was barbaric, even for them. Alistair's hand hovered near her neck. He was fighting a war inside his own skin. His muscles trembled violently. The effort to stop his hand from snatching her up and dragging her away was tearing his tendons apart. His joints popped. A bead of sweat rolled down his scarred cheek. "Submit," the wolf roared inside him. "She is ours. Show her." "I am a king," the man argued, horrified. "I bow to no one." The wolf didn't care about crowns. The wolf cared about the blood, the scent, the absolute certainty of the bond. The internal clash was so violent, Alistair felt a blood vessel burst in his nose. A single drop of dark blood slid down his philtrum. He couldn't touch her. If he touched her, he would lose whatever shred of humanity he had left. He had to show her she was safe. He had to submit to the bond. Slowly, agonizingly, Alistair's posture broke. His massive shoulders slumped. His breathing hitched, turning into a ragged, pathetic sound. Sabine opened her eyes, confused by the delay. She watched, paralyzed, as the Alpha King of Dunhelm, the monster who had crushed rebellions, the immortal warlord who had never bowed his head to a single god or emperor, bent his knees. He didn't do it gracefully. It wasn't a romantic sweeping kneel. It was a collapse. His right knee hit the flagstones with a sickening crack times that echoed up into the vaulted ceiling. It sounded like bone bruising, maybe fracturing. He didn't flinch. He brought his left knee down to join it. He was kneeling in the spilled wine and grease, the expensive bearskin mantle dragging in the dirty rushes. He bowed his head, exposing the thick muscles of his neck to her. A total, terrifying display of submission. "Mate," he ground out. The word didn't sound affectionate. It sounded like a curse. It sounded like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. For a long 10 seconds, no one breathed. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a hound whined and was quickly kicked into silence. Sabine stared down at the top of the king's head. She could see the coarse, black and gray hairs, the way they curled slightly at the nape of his neck. She could smell the metallic tang of the blood dripping from his nose. She didn't feel a magical connection. She didn't feel an overwhelming urge to touch him. She felt nauseous. "He's insane," she thought. "The king has gone mad, and I'm going to be blamed for it." She took a jerky step backward, entirely forgetting the hearth. Her bad heel caught on the uneven stone. She lost her balance, her arms windmilling as she fell backward, landing hard on her backside in the pile of spilled parsnips. The indignity of it broke the spell. Alistair's head snapped up. His eyes were returning to their normal icy blue, though the edges still bled black. He looked at her sitting in the grease, her rough-spun apron stained, her hair falling out of its messy braid. Disgust warred with a terrifying, protective possessiveness inside him. He had just surrendered his pride, his 3 centuries of unyielding authority, to a scullery maid who couldn't even stand on her own 2 feet. He felt a hot, dark shame crawl up his throat. What had he done? The entire pack had seen him break. He watched her scramble backward on her hands and feet, like a crab, trying to get away from him. She wasn't looking at him with awe. She was looking at him like he was a rabid dog. "Don't move," he commanded. His voice was gravelly, destroyed by the forced suppression of his shift. Sabine froze instantly. She pressed her back against the hot stones of the fire pit, ignoring the burning heat seeping through her wool dress. Alistair slowly pushed himself off the floor. His knee throbbed violently. He ignored it. He stood to his full height, wiping the blood from his upper lip with the back of a scarred hand. He didn't offer her a hand up. He couldn't trust himself to touch her yet. He turned his head slowly, sweeping his icy gaze over the silent hall. The wolves were watching. Some looked confused. Others looked horrified. But Alistair saw the subtle shifts in posture from the border alphas. He saw eyes narrowing. He saw the calculation. A king who bows is a king who can be broken. He had just painted a target on his own back, and by extension, on the trembling woman sitting in the vegetable grease. "Cassius," Alistair said. The command didn't echo, but it carried perfectly through the dead air. Cassius materialized at the edge of the cleared circle. His face was a carefully blank mask. "My king." "Clear the hall," Alistair ordered, not taking his eyes off Sabine. "The feast is over." "Sire, the border lords." Alistair turned his head, just a fraction, pinning his second-in-command with a glare so violently cold, Cassius actually took a physical step backward. "I said," Alistair whispered, "the feast is over. Anyone who is still in this room in 2 minutes will be considered a challenge to my throne." Pandemonium erupted. It was a silent, frantic rush. No one spoke. Chairs were knocked aside, mugs abandoned. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall were thrown open, letting in a blast of freezing winter air. The wolves, shoved each other to get out, desperate to escape the oppressive, crushing weight of the king's fractured temper. Through it all, Sabine remained frozen on the floor. Her bleeding hand throbbed. When the hall was empty, save for the king and the crackling fires, the silence returned, heavier than before. Alistair looked down at her. He felt the phantom ache in his knees. He hated her for making him do it. He hated himself for not being able to stop it. And yet, the only thing keeping him from tearing his own skin off was the scent of her blood in the air. "Get up," he said, the words harsh and flat. Sabine scrambled to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her blistered heel. She kept her bleeding hand pressed against her stomach, hiding it. She didn't look at him. She stared at a grease stain on his left boot. "What is your name?" he asked. Sabine, my lord." Her voice was a thin, raspy squeak. She cleared her throat, terrified he would punish her for stuttering. Sabine. Alistair tasted the name. It felt strange on his tongue. Common. Weak. "You are bleeding, Sabine," he noted, his voice devoid of any warmth. I'm sorry, my lord. I dropped the tray. I'll clean it. I'll scrub the stone." She started to babble, the terror finally overriding her survival instinct to stay quiet. "Please, I didn't mean to ruin the feast. I'll go back to the laundry. You won't ever have to see me." "Quiet." She snapped her mouth shut. Her teeth clicked together. Alistair closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had a headache. It felt like an axe was buried in his skull. "You aren't going back to the laundry. You aren't scrubbing the floor." He opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was painfully thin. There were dark circles under her eyes. She smelled of exhaustion and cheap soap. She was the most beautiful, devastating thing he had ever seen, and he resented her for it. "You are mine now," he stated. It wasn't a proposal. It was a bleak fact. And heaven help us both. The walk to the upper keep was an agonizing procession of two. Alistair walked a half step ahead. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, the leather of his gloves groaning under the pressure of his grip. Every instinct screamed at him to pick her up. She was limping. He could hear the uneven drag of her left foot on the stone steps, a quiet, rhythmic scrape that scraped directly against his nerve endings. The wolf inside him paced, agitated, growling, a steady litany of times. Injured, carry, protect. He ignored it. If he touched her, he wasn't sure he could let go. Sabine followed, her eyes fixed on the broad, heavily muscled expanse of his back. The bearskin mantle swayed with his heavy strides. She felt utterly disconnected from her own body. Her hand throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a hot, pulsing pain that was rapidly becoming the only real thing in the world. She didn't look at the tapestries they passed, depicting bloody hunts and howling beasts. She didn't look at the high, arched windows showing the snow-whipped night. She just focused on placing one foot in front of the other. If she stopped, she might start screaming, and she had a feeling screaming in front of the Alpha King was a bad idea. Alistair pushed open a pair of heavy oaken doors. They didn't creak. They swung silently on well-oiled iron hinges, revealing chambers that were offensively warm. The king's quarters smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the sharp, clean scent of winter pine. It was a massive room, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in dark furs. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast a whole stag. "Sit," Alistair said. He didn't point. He didn't look at her. He walked to a heavy iron washstand and poured water from a pitcher into a basin. Sabine looked around. There were no wooden benches, only velvet-cushioned chairs and a long leather settee. She was covered in soot, spilled grease, and her own blood. She looked down at her ruined apron. "I'll soil the furniture, my lord," she whispered. Alistair stopped washing his hands. He braced his weight on the rim of the wash basin, his shoulders rising and falling with a heavy sigh. He turned his head. His icy blue eyes pinned her. "Sit on the floor, then," he snapped. The harshness in his voice wasn't aimed at her, but at his own fraying patience. "Just stop moving. Sabine sank to the floor immediately, folding her legs beneath her. The woven rug beneath her knees was softer than her mattress in the servants' quarters. She cradled her bleeding hand against her stomach. A heavy knock sounded at the door. "Enter," Alistair commanded, drying his hands on a linen towel. An old man shuffled in. He didn't look like a wolf. He was stooped, balding, and smelled sharply of dried yarrow, crushed garlic, and strong alcohol. He carried a leather satchel. This was Bran, the pack's primary healer. He took one look at Alistair's rigidly tense posture, then looked at the human woman sitting on the rug. Bran's bushy eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he said nothing. He had survived 3 kings by knowing when to keep his mouth shut. "She cut her hand," Alistair said flatly, "on a rusted iron tray. Clean it. Bind it." Bran nodded. He dragged a heavy wooden stool from a corner and placed it in front of Sabine. He sat, opening his satchel. "Let me see, girl." Sabine slowly uncurled her arm. The cut was deep, slicing diagonally across the fleshy mound at the base of her thumb. Blood had pooled and begun to congeal, mixing with the dirt and grease from the kitchens. Bran unstoppered a small clay bottle. "This will burn," he warned, his voice a dry rasp. He poured the clear liquid directly over the wound. Sabine violently flinched, biting down on the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. A sharp, involuntary hiss escaped her teeth. The alcohol ate into the raw tissue, a searing, chemical fire that made her eyes water. Across the room, Alistair slammed his fist into the stone mantelpiece above the fire. The cracked times of his knuckles hitting the rock made both Sabine and Bran jump. A spiderweb fracture appeared in the solid granite. "Careful, old man," Alistair growled, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with the sudden intrusion of the wolf's anger. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring into the fire, his back to the room. Bran didn't pause his work. He took a clean linen cloth and firmly wiped away the blood and dirt. "Iron and rust, sire. If I don't clean it, the rot will take her hand. You know this." Alistair didn't answer. He just breathed, slow and heavy. He could smell her pain. It was a bitter, metallic spike in the air. It made his own chest ache. It was pathetic, he thought, bitterly. 300 years of war, and he was being undone by a human's paper cut. Bran applied a thick, greenish paste that smelled of mint and earth, then wrapped her hand tightly in clean white bandages. "Keep it dry," he muttered to Sabine. "No laundry. No dishwater." Sabine's head snapped up. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the shock. "No laundry? But the head laundress. She'll dock my copper. I have to work. If I don't work, I don't eat." The room went dead silent. Bran looked at her as if she had just sprouted a second head. He slowly turned his gaze toward the king. Alistair turned around. His expression was utterly blank. He stared at the terrified, grease-stained woman on his floor. She had just been claimed by the Alpha King, of the largest territory in the north. She was the center of a political earthquake that would likely start a civil war by morning, and she was worried about a docked copper coin from a laundress. The sheer, mundane absurdity of it broke the suffocating tension in Alistair's chest. A short, breathy sound escaped his nose. It took Sabine a second to realize it was a laugh. A dark, cynical, completely humorless laugh. "You think," Alistair said, walking slowly toward her, his boots quiet on the thick rug, "that you are going back to the washboards?" Sabine shrank back slightly. I don't know what I am supposed to do, my lord. I don't know why I am here." Alistair stopped in front of her. He looked down. He didn't kneel this time. He had given her his pride once today. He wasn't about to make a habit of it. "You are here because the fates have a sick sense of humor," Alistair said bluntly. "You are my mate. It means you belong to me. It means you sleep here. You eat here. And if anyone touches you, I will tear their arms from their sockets." You will never see the inside of a laundry room again. Sabine stared at his boots. The words didn't sound like a fairy tale. They sounded like a prison sentence. You belong to me. She swallowed hard. I see. Do you? Alistair challenged, his tone dropping into a dangerous rumble. Because you smell like a cornered rabbit, Sabine. You think I am going to eat you. Are you? She asked. The question slipped out before her brain could stop it. Raw. Honest. Alistair's eyes flared. He leaned down, bracing his hands on his knees so his face was level with hers. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He smelled of sweat, dried blood, and absolute power. If I wanted to eat you, he whispered, his voice dark and soft, I wouldn't have ruined my favorite trousers, kneeling in pork grease to claim you. He stood up abruptly, turning his back on her again. Bran, get out. The old healer packed his satchel with record speed and scurried out the door, pulling it shut with a quiet click. They were alone. The fire popped, throwing sparks against the iron grating. Sabine sat on the floor, cradling her bandaged hand. She looked at the massive bed. She looked at the heavy locked doors. She realized, with a sinking, terrifying clarity, that she had survived the kitchen only to be thrown into the fire. The quiet didn't last. It couldn't. 30 minutes after Bran left, the heavy doors opened without a knock. Cassius strode in. His face was rigid. The deep scar across his cheek pulled taut. He didn't look at Sabine, who was still sitting precisely where Alistair had left her, her back against the base of the settee. Speak, Alistair commanded. He was standing by the window, staring out into the dark. Lord Holden has left the keep, Cassius reported, his voice clipped. He took his guard. They are riding hard for the eastern border. Lord Vance is still in the courtyard, rallying his men. He's talking loudly, sire, talking about weakness, talking about how a king who bows to a human servant is no king at all. Alistair didn't move. He didn't act surprised. Vance, always, was a loudmouth. Has he drawn steel? Not yet, but his men are armed. They are blocking the main gate. They are demanding an audience. Cassius paused, his eyes finally flicking to Sabine. They want the human dead, Alistair. They think she's a witch. They think she ensorcelled you. Sabine's breath hitched. She pulled her knees to her chest. A witch. The punishment for witchcraft wasn't a quick death. It was the pyre. Alistair finally turned away from the window. His face was a mask of cold, predatory calm. The internal war that had paralyzed him in the Great Hall was gone. This was politics. This was violence. This was a language he had spoken fluently for 3 centuries. Let them think what they want, Alistair said softly. He walked to a heavy oak chest at the foot of his bed and threw it open. He bypassed the velvet cloaks and reached into the bottom, pulling out a broadsword. The steel sang a quiet, deadly note as he drew it from its oiled scabbard. You're going down there? Cassius asked, stepping forward. Alistair, let me handle Vance. If you kill him tonight, you alienate the entire southern quadrant. If I don't kill him tonight, Alistair replied, inspecting the edge of the blade, I invite every minor lord with a grudge to challenge me by dawn. I bowed, Cassius. I showed them my neck. I have to remind them why they don't dare bite it. Cassius grimaced, but he nodded. He understood the brutal math of werewolf hierarchy. And the girl? Alistair looked at Sabine. She looked so small, swallowed by the shadows of the massive room. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight. She wasn't crying. She was just bracing herself. She had the look of a stray dog that fully expected to be kicked. It made his chest tight. He hated that feeling. He walked over to her. He didn't crouch this time. He unclasped the heavy black bearskin mantle from his shoulders. He threw it over her. The pelt was heavy. It smelled overwhelmingly of him, pine, ozone, and danger. It settled over her shoulders like a lead weight, burying her in warmth. Cassius stays at the door, Alistair told her. He didn't offer reassurances. He didn't tell her it would be okay. If anyone other than me tries to open it, Cassius will kill them. If they kill Cassius, take the iron poker from the fireplace and aim for the eyes. Sabine stared up at him. She gripped the edges of the bearskin mantle with her good hand. You're going to fight them. Because of me. I am going to fight them because they are stupid enough to stand in my courtyard with drawn swords, Alistair corrected, his voice flat. You are just the excuse they've been waiting for. Don't flatter yourself. It was a cruel thing to say, but it was exactly what Sabine needed to hear. It stripped away the terrifying mysticism of the mate bond. It brought the situation down to reality. She wasn't a magical princess causing a war of love. She was a political liability. That she could understand. Alistair turned and walked out the door. Cassius followed, pulling the heavy oak doors shut with a definitive, echoing thud. The lock clicked. Sabine was alone. She sat in the silence for a long time. The mantle was suffocatingly heavy, but she didn't take it off. It was a shield. She looked at the fire. She looked at the iron poker resting on the stone hearth. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up from the floor. Her heel throbbed. Her hand ached. She limped over to the fireplace and picked up the iron poker. It was heavy, designed for turning massive logs. She gripped it tight, resting the cold iron against her leg. She didn't know how long she stood there. The heavy stone walls muffled the sounds from the courtyard. She couldn't hear the snarling. She couldn't hear the clash of steel. She just watched the fire burn down to glowing red embers. An hour passed. Maybe 2. Then, the lock clicked. Sabine raised the iron poker, stepping back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door pushed open. Alistair stood in the doorway. He was alone. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a monster. His white linen shirt was torn open, soaked in fresh, bright, red blood. He had a deep, jagged slash across his collarbone that was already beginning to knit together, pulling the edges of the skin tight. His knuckles were raw and split. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He leaned heavily against the wood, closing his eyes. His breathing was ragged. The air in the room instantly changed. The scent of pine and ozone was overpowered by the thick, sickening smell of slaughtered wolves. Sabine didn't lower the poker. She stared at the blood on his hands. "Did you kill him?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. Alistair opened his eyes. He looked at the iron poker in her hands. He looked at the way she was wearing his mantle, drowning in it, yet standing her ground. A strange, unfamiliar flicker of pride sparked in his chest. "Yes," Alistair said simply. He pushed himself off the door, walking slowly toward the washstand. He stripped the ruined, bloody shirt over his head, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at the healing slash on his chest. He picked up the linen towel he had used earlier and began to wipe the blood from his arms. "They won't challenge again tonight," he said, not looking at her. "Tomorrow, they will complain to the council. They will demand you be tested. They will look for any weakness." He threw the bloody towel into the basin. The water turned pink. He finally turned to look at her. He was exhausted. The violent adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing weight of his centuries. "I cannot protect you from all of them," Alistair said, the brutal honesty laying bare the reality of their situation. "I am the king, but I am surrounded by wolves waiting for me to bleed. You are a target now, and you are painfully human." Sabine lowered the iron poker, letting the tip rest against the floorboards. She looked at the blood drying on his skin. She looked at the heavy bags under his eyes. He wasn't a romantic hero who had swept her away. He was a tired, violent man chained to a destiny he despised as much as she did. She gripped the edges of the bearskin mantle tighter. She felt the blister on her heel. She felt the sharp sting of her bandaged hand. She was alive. "I survived the kitchens," Sabine said, her voice quiet but entirely steady. I can survive a few angry dogs. Alistair stared at her. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. Just a fraction. A cynical ghost of a smile. He walked toward the bed, collapsing onto the edge of the mattress. "Put the poker down, Sabine," he murmured, his eyes slipping shut. "And get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be hell." Sabine didn't put the poker down. She walked over to the heavy velvet armchair near the fire, sitting down stiffly. She pulled the mantle tight around her throat, rested the iron across her lap, and kept her eyes open. The king's knees hit the stone, but the true fall has only just begun. Can Sabine survive the violent politics of a werewolf court, or will Alistair's resentful claim be the death of them both? Thank you for listening to this dark fantasy audio story. If you felt the tension in that great hall, please hit that like button. Share the story with your fellow dark romance readers, and subscribe to the channel for more. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.